Okay, hello and welcome to another episode of the Religion Podcast. This podcast on religion by the Black Sheep, in association with the Unredacted, is an attempt to initiate a public dialogue on religion. In this series, we examine the role of religion in our lives and its relationship with law, culture, and politics. Based on our open call for submissions, we asked contributors from across the world to share their personal stories and experiences with religion or the lack of it with us. You can read all these submissions on the Black Sheep digital platform. In this very special episode with Achin Vanaik, we're trying to make sense of the political and mobilizational effects of religion with respect to nationalist politics and communal polarization. We will be talking about far-right nationalist political parties like the BJP, the future of secular left parties, and much more. Over to you, Prerna.
This is our fourth episode in our religion series. I am Prerna Dadu, the co-founder of the Unredacted podcast. And today we're here with a very special guest, Mr. Achin Vanaik. He is a writer, a social activist, a former professor at DU, and a Delhi-based fellow of the Transnational Institute of Amsterdam. Achin has authored, edited, and contributed to many books ranging from studies of India's political economy, issues concerning religion, communalism, and secularism, as well as international contemporary politics and nuclear disarmament. His most cited book is The Furies of Indian Communalism, Religion, Modernity, and Secularization. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have this chat with you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here and I look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you. Pooja, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to, at the outset, ask you about the distinction that you draw between far-right and fascist parties, which I personally find quite interesting. You've made this sort of a bold claim that the BJP is a far-right nationalist party that uses religion to sort of mobilize its voters, but you still don't see it as a fascist party. Would you like to comment on that?
I've always written and said that it is a far-right party with fascist characteristics. But not a far-right party, not a fascist party in the sense that everybody, in trying to understand what contemporary far-right parties are like and whether they are fascist or fascistic, have to start from the interwar period. Because everybody accepts that even though there may have been fascist ideas and fascist-like movements, when you're talking about fascism, you're really talking about Italy as the first fascist form of fascism, and then Germany, Hitler's Germany. And if you take any definition, any minimalist definition of fascism, because even as we accept that there are varieties of fascism, you have to agree on some minimum characteristics that constitute it. And here you will find that there are differences between liberals and Marxists, and even among Marxists and even among liberals, there'll be differences of various kinds. Please note that Mussolini insisted that at the heart of fascism was the question of the fascist state. If you make a fascist movement your most important, characteristic for defining fascism, then you'll find lots of fascisms. If you make the state, which must combine with a certain kind of movement, then it comes stricter. Let me put it this way to you. There is a spectrum of right-wing parties and far-right parties. Okay? We all accept that there are far-right parties and there's a spectrum. We can even accept that there are far-right forces that are not fascist. A military dictatorship, for example. Okay? The question then is, where are you going to place variants of fascism or fascism on this spectrum? Do you see fascism at the extreme end of far-right forces, or do you see somewhere 3/4 down the way? If you position fascism somewhere like 3/4 down the way, then you will have a much larger umbra and penumbra of what you consider to be parties. If you position it at the very end of your spectrum, then the number of variants of fascism will also be smaller. Now, I say that fascism is much worse than military dictatorships because of the fascist movement which gives it a kind of popularity and foundation that military dictatorships don't have. So you have to have a fascist movement, but it must culminate in a fascist state. And a fascist state is a dictatorship against those who oppose it. And also remember that both when you talked about Italy and you talk Mussolini and when you talk about Hitler, and when you even talk about fascist currents and movements in Europe, they were related to imperialism. In other words, you also have to decide whether you think fascism is the most extreme negative form of nationalism, most reactionary form of nationalism. But are you also going to say or not say that it is by its very nature also the most reactionary form of imperialism or internationalism? In other words, that it was an international threat. If you dismiss that, then of course you can say Puerto Rico is fascism. You can say some other country is fascism. But then you're severing the connection between Italy and Hitler and the Second World War. The fact that they had to fight against other imperialisms and so on. Okay? Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion about how to go define fascism. You can read my book. I have two recent books. One is The Hindutva Rising, which came out in 2018 here in India. The British edition and the American edition was in 2017. And then there's one in 2020. I don't get into that here. But I would simply say that if you say fascist, and if you want to resist fascism, then it has to be a fascist dictatorship. Unless, of course, you simply want to say that the state is not so important. It's fascist because of the character of the movement. But if you recognize that it's a fascist state, then there is no space for above ground or struggles above ground, as it were, within the existing framework. My view is that you will have to fight against the BJP, the Sangh Parivar, at all levels. And that there is also going to be space at certain levels here. In other words, this Hindu nationalist fascistic party is not going to eliminate all the rights of everybody, including all Hindus in every way and all that. And in fact, it seems to have understood that keeping a democratic facade is very useful for it because it gives it a legitimacy nationally and internationally. So I would say that here. The last point I would make about this is that don't get too worked up about whether you're right or wrong about whether it's fascist or fascistic. There's a difference between what's called theoretical understanding and programmatic understanding. And there is no automatic connection between your theoretical understanding and your programmatic understanding of what to do to fight against it. What I mean by that is you can have two people who say it's fascist, but say that in order to fight it, we must align with certain forces in a strategic sense to fight it. And then you'll have others who say it's fascist, but we mustn't align. And the same thing with those who say it's fascistic. We should have a strategic alliance with this. And we should not. In other words, it's much more important to be able to agree on how best to fight it in the long term than to worry too much about whether we should call it fascist or fascistic. So I don't get too worked up about it, but there is a certain connection. And there are many more things that one can say. For example, liberals dismiss the question of capitalism. That's why they use the term totalitarianism. Marxists and others insist that the question of fascism arose in the context of a great crisis of capitalism, not just nationally, but internationally. So these are other aspects here. So I would say, don't get too worked up about people say it's fascism, but at least we recognize it's a terrible far-right force. And unlike fascism, which in my class of fascism, which is mercurial, it reaches its apex when it comes to power at the center. And then if it's defeated, that's it. Here we are talking about a far-right force, which is very different from any other far-right force anywhere else in the world. It has a continuous existence of over 90 years. It has the deepest implantation in civil society before it comes to state power, and then reinforces that with the state power. This is very much unlike the case of Mussolini, Hitler, and others. It is really a short-term movement, not a long-term implantation over decades and so on here, and then comes to power, and then, of course, it does whatever. The state is far more central to that. Whereas I've always argued that this is a longer-term problem, which is not as bad as the fascist state, but is much more deeply ingrained and therefore constitutes a longer term problem, which you have to resolve here. So that implantation, there's that here. All of these things also become very important. Another distinction, of course, is that in India, the BJP Jan Sangh is the only party in India which has never had a major split. Congress has had, left has, all that. So here there's an indication that why is there have not a split? And the answer is very simple. Unlike, say, left parties or whatever, where your activists and your cadres are supposed to have a larger vision of everything. And, you're supposed to address all kinds of problems, from sexism to racism to economy and so on, and all sorts of issues, how to move. Yeah. For the average cadre of the Sangh Parivar, etc., all you need to respond to is that this is a Hindu nation and we must make a Hindu Rashtra. And in order for us to make a Hindu Rashtra, the most important thing is to unite Hindus. And that's a solution towards this thing. In fact, if you like Savarkar's famous phrase for what constitutes, we must make India, which is a Hindu nation, strong. And in order to do that, we must, in his one phrase, we must unite Hindus and we must militarize Hindudom. Mm-hmm. It's strong. So that leads to the question of how do you go about, how do the forces of the Sangh Parivar go about trying to unite Hindus? But that's a separate question. I don't know if you want to ask that.
Yes. Before we go into the discussion on Hindutva and Hindu nationalism and how the BJP has sort of appropriated that, I just wanted a quick follow-up question using the discourse that we've just discussed right now in terms of the political spectrum and where you see different parties. I just wanted to know your thoughts on the Aam Aadmi Party and where you see it placed on the political spectrum. Also, its role in the future of Indian politics. What are your thoughts on AAP as a political party?
Let me give you an international comparative perspective with regard to the Congress Party, okay? And that history, because most people don't give that international perspective. The Congress Party was the party that led the struggle for national liberation. In Latin America, you also had what were called Congress-type populist parties that led their own struggles for independence. And after the Second World War, like the Congress Party, were committed to a kind of import substitute industrialization process. Now, so the Congress Party is distinctive because it's in India. But it's not that distinction in terms of being what was called a kind of bourgeois, centrist, populist type party. What does that mean? It means that you have a left wing within the party, you have a right wing within the party, and you have a controlling, moderating center within it. And this is not simply a characteristic of Congress, this is a characteristic of any number of Latin American parties, in Peru, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, and so many places elsewhere. Now, they follow for decades after the Second World War, because Latin American countries were independent earlier, import substituting industrialization. What happens? After decades of loyalty and so on, they fail to address adequately the problem of development for everybody and for that. What do you have then? You have, after a prolonged period of time, all of these populist type parties moving in two directions. Either they fade away and disappear, and a lot of people are now talking about the Congress Party disappear, or they transmogrify into much smaller, no longer populist bourgeois centrist type parties, but right-wing parties. Not far-right parties, but right-wing parties. And of course, the criteria for judging that they're right-wing parties, in my view, of course, has to do with the question of accepting not just capitalism, but the contemporary form of capitalism, which really emerges from the late 70s, early 80s onwards, which is a neoliberal form of capitalist this thing. So it's a chasma. In the vacuum of space that is created, you begin to find other parties coming up. In Latin America, you have other right-wing parties coming up, and you have some left-wing parties coming up. So as you have the decline of the Congress, you have this phenomenon of other parties coming up. Look at the Congress hegemony till about the late 60s. You have the decline of the Congress, and what happens? You have a number of regional parties coming up. Correct? Coming from the Loya Hayek tradition. Yeah? and they become bigger here. And then you have other parties coming up, okay? Then you have 3 occasions on which you have a bourgeois centrist type party coming to power at the center as a replacement of the Congress. The Janata Party during the emergency, right? BP Singh's Janata Dal and Deve Gowda's and the other party which comes to power here, UDF, right? Not one of them lasts there a full term. It is only after these 3 attempts at a bourgeois centrist party at power that you have these BJP. It changes its name from Jan Sangh to BJP coming to power at the center. It was part of the coalition in 1977, but that's a different matter. Didn't last, it pulls out. Okay? So you have this whole trajectory of the Congress decline. In other words, it is not so much politically, electorally that the rise of the BJP, Sangh Parivar, and other parties cause the decline of the Congress. It's more that the decline of the Congress creates the space where they emerge. Okay? The AAP is the most recent party that has come out of this overall situation in India's economy. Yeah? And what is it? It is a party. There's another thing I should say before I come to that. The Congress party has evolved from a more liberal, more secular party, understood in a very weak way anyway, but still secular, to now adopting a soft Hindutva as its only way. The AAP is born out of the anti-corruption movement in which the RSS played a crucial role. You have a person there who attracted a lot of people around him, but the internal structure of the AAP is thoroughly undemocratic. And that's why, in fact, you had lots of other groups, people, Swaraj, Yogendra Yadav, so many others leaving in imitation. Yeah? And it's run undemocratically from the top. And from the very beginning, it is a party that wants to emphasize the question that we are not corrupt, and it is less corrupt, much less corrupt than other parties, and says that we want to focus on governance in terms of giving some basic welfare. These welfare measures that it wants to give are within the framework of what is called compensatory neoliberalism. It's not a serious challenge to the existing system there, but it emphasizes welfareism. And in fact, the Congress party, which inaugurated neoliberalism, the BJP under Modi, they also play this game of compensatory, giving some welfare schemes and so on. So the selling point of the AAP is that we are not corrupt and that we are, look at how we run Delhi, and we've done mohalla clinics and we've done schools, which is good, fine, it's been better than others. But as far as Hindutva is concerned, as far as nationalism is concerned, it is born and will continue to remain a party that is not going to seriously challenge any of this at all. Quietly accepts Article 370, goes on about how we are nationalists, etc. Look at its behavior during the Delhi riots on the CA, all of that here. And of course, Hanuman Chalisa, all that we use with this. So all that is there. So if you have any hopes that the AAP is going to be a serious challenger to this thing, none of these parties are prepared to take on upfront the question of Hindutva. They've all accommodated themselves towards it. The parties that have not accommodated, nobody wants to talk about them because they're also in decline. And that's the mainstream left parties. Whatever their deficiencies, which are real, there are one parties that don't play this soft Hindutva game in the way that the other parties play. So that's my attitude about it. It's extended itself here. People say, okay, will give us a better chance, etc. But if you think this is a party that is going to fight against, ideologically and politically against Hindu nationalism, well, look at what it's doing. And look at what it's saying. It's prepared to accommodate itself towards that, avoid talking, and back aggressive nationalism. It's not going to talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons. It's not going to talk about friendship with Pakistan or anything like that, etc. It will want to, in fact, show itself as being even more. And that's an indication of how much the spectrum of politics has changed. The center of gravity of Indian politics has changed as a result of the rise of the Sangh Parivar and the forces of Hindu nationalism.
In the context of the rise of the Sangh Parivar, we see a lot of conversation about India becoming a Hindu nation and moving away from a secular framework that was promised by the constitution makers since India's rebirth after independence. So, what does it mean for India to now become a Hindu nation? And what does it mean for India to be a Hindu Rashtra, even at a national level and at a geopolitical level?
Well, the point is this thing is that if you talk to the Sangh Parivar, they will say that India has always been a Hindu Rashtra, Hindu nation. And then they'll also say we have to construct a Hindu Rashtra, right? Which indicates that it's not yet a Hindu nation. But the idea of a Hindu nation comes to the idea of what is a nation, really. And what happens here is that you have, it actually comes, the idea of this, that the Sangh Parivar has about the essence of a nation really comes from 19th century German Orientalism and Romanticism. And that's that the nation is a living organism. And because it's a living organism, it has indelible characteristics. These are what make the nation. It has an essence. It has a soul that never changes throughout the centuries and is rooted in the nature of the past. So forget about the fact that throughout the 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, there are movement of people, there are migration, there are kingdoms, there are that, there are declining territories, all that. Forget all about it. There is an essence, which is what makes it the nation. And that essence is its Hinduness. And then, of course, the Hinduness is connected in some cases towards the question of religion. And of course, it can also be connected to questions of blood and soil. You Muslims don't realize that you're Hindus actually, because you are part of here. But you're betraying us because you're not understanding that this is Hindu nation. So this idea of a Hindu nation as being something which is ancient and which is indelible and essentialist is, of course, for many others, absolute nonsense. The nation is a modern construct. What you call India today has territories which are never part of any ancient kingdom here. Think of what the Northeast or whatever it is. It's a modern construct. And besides, but you have to, and most nationalists claim that there is something at the in the past. They invent, if you like, a past for themselves. Let me just very quickly say the danger for that. I'll drop the question of Hindu Rashtra, is that you have to decide in constructing in the nation, whether it's a modern construct or not. Of course it is. Second, what does that mean? Either you're going to see the essence of that, or you're going to see the nation as having an inheritance from the past. If you see the nation as always having an inheritance from the past, there is always going to be dispute about what is the proper inheritance and who are the proper inheritors. So here, Hinduness is the proper inheritance. And Hinduism is the proper inheritance and Hindus are the proper inheritors. And you who are not this thing here, you are weakening us because you don't accept it. Or you recognize that the nation belongs to the present and the future. It is always going to be what we make of it. Are we going to make it more humane, decent, inclusive, and all that? Or are we going to say, no, this is it? So, and in fact, what happens is that nations get born out of something. You have the formation of Pakistan on the basis of Islam, and then you have Bangladesh breaking away. You have South Sudan coming up here, and then you have South Sudan breaking away. You have the British Empire, and don't be entirely surprised if in the coming years Scotland breaks away. You have new nations emerging from everywhere, this, that, etc. And you find that nations, the character of a nation, the understanding of what it means to be a nation also changes. So, for example, once upon a time in the United States, white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism was thought to be the heart of it. In another 20, 30 years, non-whites are going to be a majority in the United States. It's an immigrant society. Nobody talks in the United States. They still talk ugly things about how America is great and all that. But nobody talks about America except a minority, which was not a minority once, that this is a fundamentally white supremacist society. So the question of being present of how you make it and change it becomes very. In other words, there's always competing understandings of nationalism that fight with each other. There are more exclusive forms and there are more inclusive forms. Even the inclusive forms have big problems, but that's another issue. And therefore you have. As for the question of Hindu Rashtra, that's very simple. The fundamental idea of Hindu Rashtra, I just told you, Savarkar's thing about uniting Hindus and militarizing Hindudom. The Jansang wanted nuclear weapons for India before the Chinese got them. Did you know that? It wasn't because the Chinese or the Pakistanis had it that they wanted it. They wanted it because they want to make India strong. And they've always wanted that here. But leave that aside. How do you unite Hindus? I'm afraid there are only two ways. There's not three or four ways. One is that you have to find some principle of unification that is internal to Hinduism. The only candidate for that is a kind of loose and accommodating Brahmanism. You have to make it loose and accommodating. You have to be Brahmanic because you have to keep the forward caste and upper caste and all the leaders of the RSS and all that there. But how can you expand it unless you also make it more accommodating, which they are trying to do with some success? But that cannot, India is so diverse in terms of language, in terms of caste breaks and all, it's much more difficult to do it that way. So the second one you do is that you try to unite what you call the Hindu community against someone, which is a characteristic of all far-right authoritarian populisms or authoritarian nationalisms. And in this case, of course, it's your minorities, Christians, if you like, communists, others, but above all, Muslims. And therefore, how do you create a sense of hostility towards Muslims? In India, it's a little bit tricky. It's rather difficult. Nobody is going to say that Muslims dominate India. Muslims rule India. You can't say that. In fact, according to the Sacha Committee report, they're among the poorest sections overall, along with STs and SCs and the most backward castes within the OBC. So in that case, what do? Well, first you play the politics of historical revenge. But they ruled us before. And you don't say that Mughals ruled us or Persians ruled or they have just one kingdom they came and stayed here. It's not like colonialism. I started with somewhere else here. Or Persians or Mughals or Turks or something. You say Muslims, because if you say Muslim, you can unite all of them. And you can also unite those who came by trade and those who became here, converted in the south and all that. So that's your basic way of doing that. So that's central to their whole project of doing that. And unfortunately, because of so many insecurities of various kinds, people are buying into it to a larger extent. They're getting some sense of, well, at least we are Hindus. And therefore, we have a party which belongs to us and will help us in some particular way. That becomes a larger sense of this thing. But of course, it's a very horrible and terrible anti-democratic, exclusivist thing, which of course creates so many tension, but it's there in other countries. And yeah, anyway, I'll stop here. What do you call it? How do you unite the Hindu community against Muslims? I mentioned the politics of historical revenge. There are two other aspects. One is, of course, to cultivate grievances. You can't cultivate grievances, and this, of course, means how? And you also cultivate fear. How do you cultivate fear? Their population is growing. 4 wives and 20 children, and all this nonsense. And love jihad, which incidentally is a preoccupation with Muslim men and Hindu women. It's not so much a preoccupation of Hindu men and Muslim women, because that's bringing the Muslim women into the proper fold. But you have that patriarchal dimension there. But love jihad, land jihad, general fear. Oh, Pakistan, terrorists. So that's one. And grievances, for example, which you cultivate. Nobody's going to say that they're richer than you as a community or anything like that. So, but there has been some reform of Hindu law, but they are not yet there. And look at this hijab. And you try to pretend that this is, of course, something that they are getting away with, which we Hindus and all don't have. But you can be damn sure that the Sangh Parivar is not going to have a campaign against the Mangal Sutra, which, of course, is what? It means that in any marriage, the woman must wear the Mangala Sutra, which shows that she's the property of the husband. And of course, in all marriage ceremonies, in Hindu marriage or Sikh marriage, when you have to go around the fire, the havan, who do you think is ahead and who do you think is behind? The man is ahead and the woman is behind. But anyway, I leave that all aside. These are simply ways in which they deliberately cultivate hostility in various ways. So anyway, other questions?
Yes, I had a question, which is whenever we talk about communal polarization, there is this view that the BJP has sort of perfected how to divide people along religious lines, and they have done it using the media, WhatsApp, and these are media primarily as an institution to play divisive politics in the country. But my question is that, do you think majority of the Hindus are victims of this hate politics, of this divisive agenda that the BJP plays using the media, or do you think they are willing collaborators in the regime? Meaning to say, do you think if we go by the economic model of religion, if we look at it as an economic institution, do you think there is a demand for the hate generated by far right parties like the BJP, or do you really think people are innocent victims who need to be sort of saved in all of this? And if so, then how do we do that?
This is too extreme. What you have to understand is that if, insofar as if we should be talking about the Sangh Parivar establishing a certain kind of hegemony, if you like. The hegemony involves an ideological dimension in which you also gain consent. Of course, there are other aspects of hegemony that I told you, but one aspect of hegemony is gaining consent, and consent comes in three forms. There is active consent. Yeah, that's great. Colonialism benefits if there are people who say active consent and say, well, colonialism is good for us. They're bringing schools and colleges and so on. And you have to accept that there are a large number of people in these middle class, others, who are now more actively supportive of Hindu. That is to say, they bought into that ideology. You also have what's called passive consent. Passive consent can be, look, we just want to carry on with our lives. We don't want to make any trouble at this and that. And that can also be connected to questions of fear. It can be connected to questions of wanting to live our own lives and so on. And the third is what is called bought consent. You give me this and I will support you. So, for example, the welfare schemes of Modi seems to have played a role with many women voting for the BJP in these UP elections. So you'll have a mixture of all of these developments over here. You also have the fact that when your lives are tough and miserable, seeing that you're part of a larger Hindu fold, like many Dalits and families have come and actually cultivated, is that you also begin to have a sense of cultural upliftment. I'm part of a larger Hindu. And don't forget that the Hindutva support also comes from their implantation of any number of people who also do create loyalties, not simply by their ideologies, but by the schools that they run. The Sangh Parivar is the largest private network of schools in this country. They are active during earthquakes. The local will give children, your sons and daughters, a place to meet and play games. They can even help you to get a doctor. All of these factors also create that. It's something that the left used to do when it had cadres in many places. So in other words, you win loyalty from people in different ways. Yes, what I can say is that you have had a functional relationship between most Hindus and Muslims. You have most Hindus and Muslims on both sides having stereotype understandings of the other community, which are only broken among their personal friendships. So, no, you're not like most Muslims. No, you're not like most Hindus. But the stereotypes also remain. These stereotypes don't necessarily lead to beating up people or wanting to hate them and all. So you have a mixture, indifference, anger, fear. All one can say is that the elements of anger and even hatred have grown because they have been systematically cultivated by a force. And people move towards this in ways here. And above all, let's understand one thing, that it's not the religion that I mentioned that is so important, it's the nationalist dimension. That's why you find that religions don't confront nationalism. They have to try to co-opt it. And this is very, very important to understand. You have forces, Islamic religious extremism, which talk about the caliphate of uniting pan-Muslims globally. It is not going to work. Because what happens is you find Islamic states fighting each other. The two majority Shia states in the world fought the second longest war of the 20th century, Iraq and Iran. So even that they're both Shia didn't prevent it. Yeah? You find that just because countries are Christian doesn't mean that they'll give up their nationalism in here. To give you the example of Hindutva, Hindutva talks about an Akhand Bharat. Can you imagine what the response will be of the Nepali Hindu who RSS fellow says, look, you're a Hindu like us. Huh? Forget your Nepaliness. Come and join us in the larger effort to create a large Hindu Akhand Bharat, a great Hindu nation. You know what the Nepali Hindu would say? Say, listen, I'm a Hindu, I'm proud of it, I'm happy. But you, Mr. Big Brother India, don't tell me I should give up my Nepaliness. Who the hell are you? And they won't. The same thing with regard to Tamil Elam in Sri Lanka. Now the question then becomes, nationalism is a more powerful unifying force than even the question of religion, which is why they have to opt and co-opt. And that's why you find that all your right and far-right authoritarian populisms trying to become popular are all authoritarian nationalisms. Whether it's Brazil, whether it's Le Pen in France, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, whether it's Trump, whatever, it's authoritarian nationalism. Even though this bunch never fought in the national liberation struggle, etc., they have to try to co-opt these icons so as to pretend that they are an important force which has continuity with that. Hence,
right. You spoke of tools that can unite the population of the country against this hegemonization of Hindu forces. So can we somehow think of secularism being one of them as being ingrained into the sort of constitutional morality that people have been trying to uphold in masses? And we've seen this since the CA protests and then the farmers' protests, where the aspect of secularism has been used to fight back the imposition of Hindu majoritarianism. So do you think, is that a useful tool? And how does that sort of integrate with the idea of a nationalism?
Farmer struggle and the question of the CAA struggles. Huh? The farmer struggle was one which is on material reasons, the nature of their economy, their livelihood being threatened and so on. Huh? A dominant force was Sikhs and Sikh farmers. And Punjab, of course, you had from Haryana, you had help from elsewhere, but that was there. And Punjab is the one state in which the idea of Hindu nationalism has the least purchase, pretty obviously. Huh? Why? Because Sikhs are a majority and you have hardly any Muslims. After partition, you have Muslims. It's very difficult to do that here. Plus Sikhs, increasingly, although Hindutva says that you Sikhs and you Buddhists and you Jains are part of Hinduness, right? You have some Jains who don't like it, and Sikhs are saying, what are you talking about? We're a different religion. So it's very difficult for Hindutva to explain there. So that was much more related to material reasons. So when you talk about the CAA, what was distinctive about this is that women came out in large scale, and they came out in the sense of saying that why are you having this discrimination in these new laws about fast-tracking non-Muslims from Muslim majority neighboring countries. And they opposed it in the name of we are Indians. We are as much Indian as everybody else. Huh? Now that made it difficult, but for this government and for the forces of Hindutva to say that you are made it more difficult, but it didn't stop them from saying this is anti-national. It's much more difficult to say that to the farmers in Punjab because they're also the sons of those who fought in the army and so on, etc., and more difficult. But these are Muslim women and majority Muslim there. So you can try and push that line, which they try to do. And they were saying that we are Indians, we're part of the recognized constitution. Please notice the perniciousness of this CAA. The CAA says that that's a cover-up. They said, oh, Christians and Parsis and others, because what a number of Christians, Parsis, Sikhs are there in Afghanistan. But and what did the CAA say? Very important to understand. They said that non-Muslim minorities in these three majority Muslim countries of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are by virtue of being non-Muslim minorities persecuted. Yeah? You don't have to prove persecuted. They are axiomatically, automatically persecuted. Because they're automatically persecuted religious minorities, they have a right to come to India and we can fast track this here. But please notice something. There are Rohingya Muslims who are persecuted in Burma. They're Muslims, so no, it doesn't apply to them. There are Tamil Elams in Sri Lanka who are also persecuted. But you talk about Hindus, but why wasn't it extended to Hindus in Sri Lanka to come there? Because if you extend this to Hindus in Sri Lanka, and if you extend this to Myanmar, Burma, then what you're really saying is that these are Buddhist majority countries. And Buddhism is supposed to be acceptable to Hindutva. So you can't say that Buddhist majority countries are axiomatically persecuting non-Buddhist religious minorities. So even the Hindus in Sri Lanka, you can't call it, because then, yeah. So what was the purpose? The purpose is not so much to try to protect the persecuted, but to hammer the countries which have a Muslim majority. It's part of the larger thing. And of course, it's the first time that you introduce the question of religious discrimination into as part of the Constitution, Indian laws, into the question of citizenship, right over there. So I think it's very important one. But secularism is, let's understand what secular, I won't go on about secularism unless you want me to, but a secular state, and what's the relationship between a secular state and democracy? A secular state is three things. One, it's not the job of the state to help you to get spiritual fulfillment through your particular religion. That's not the job of the state. It's not meant to be an Islamic state, this that help you in some way. You are second, you should have no control of, on the state apparatus, there should be no control of religious institutions and religious personnel, and even religious beliefs in that here. So you should have a secular constitution. And third, following this, of course, is that citizenship rights are irrespective of your religious affiliation. These are three basic principles of the secular state. You already have this weakening because you have Yogi Adityanath, who's an acting religious personnel being chief minister of the country. Yeah. But these are the three things of a secular state. Secularism doesn't mean separation of economics, of politics and religion, but it does mean a basic separation of the state and religion in the way that I pointed this out to you. The relationship between secularism and democracy is that secularism is the necessary but not sufficient condition for having a democracy. So you can have a secular state which are undemocratic. And you can, for example, Kemal Atatürk's secular state of Turkey. Think of the old Soviet Union. Think of China. Think of Albania. They were secular states. But the rights that were given to people, irrespective of their religious affiliation, were not democratic rights. So it doesn't follow automatically. If you're secular, you're democratic. And you can have a secular state which becomes weaker and weaker in its secularity. And if it was democratic, that democracy becomes weaker and weaker. And the democracy can even be weaker and weaker, even if the secularity remains okay. So, for example, in many Western countries which have secular states, okay, in some countries like US, you have a stronger religious element. In much of Western Europe, you don't have a religious dimension or growth of Christianity, to the same way that you have Christian evangelism in the States. But their democracy is weakening because their democracy is also connected to so many other things. So the real question is, yes, we have to fight against religious extremism. We have to fight to defend and deepen the secular character of the state. And that is part of the process of actually deepening and fighting to preserve democracy. But it's only one part. There's so many other levels at which you have to fight to preserve democracy and to make it stronger. So there's no shortcut. I mean, yes, we are, and let's understand one thing about communalism is that you can have religious fundamentalisms, but religious fundamentalism, there is what is called religio-political movements. Most religious fundamentalists are religio-political movements, but not all. Some religious fundamentalists turn away from politics internally. They become small sects which aren't bothered. think of the Amish or think of some other group who just turn in upon themselves. Okay? But otherwise, mostly fundamentalism. Religious fundamentalists, there is religious nationalism. Religious nationalism will always be anti-secular, but not necessarily anti-religious other. Iran is anti-secular. It's not anti-Christian. It's anti the US. US is called the Satan. But that's not because US is a Christian majority country. It's because the US foreign policy and the way it's here, right? But when you have communalism, communalism takes place in a multi-religious society. And central to the idea of communalism is not just anti-secular, but anti some religious other. And you will have minority communalisms and majority communalisms. And we have to fight both because they both feed each other. But having said this, let's not make the mistake of thinking that both are equally dangerous. The ultimate logic and dynamic of a minority communalism is separation. Pakistan. The ultimate dynamic of a majority communalism is nationalism, to take over the whole of the society to change it. So even as we recognize that we have to fight all of these, never make the mistake of thinking that minority communalism is more dangerous or equally dangerous. Majority communalism can adopt the guise of nationalism in a way that minority communalism cannot do so. The Armenians suffering in Turkey, etc., want to move away. So all that, I think, is something that we have to understand.
Since we're talking about nationalism, could we also discuss like the different strands of nationalism that we faced across the nation states throughout history?
Okay, well, the point here about this thing is that if you look at all the nations that have existed, right, can you find one single thing that is common to all these nations and nationalism? One single thing. Is it religion? No, because there are nations that are not based on religion. Is it language? Well, there are English-speaking countries that are separate nations and don't want to become one nation, the same nation. Go tell a Canadian that you should give up and become part of the United States. Tell all the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America that. So, what is what territory? Hawaii was separate from the United States for many centuries, but they're very happy to be part of the United States. That sense of nation. Puerto Rico, they're not happy. So it was religion. I gave you the example of what do you call it? Pakistan. Buddhism. Do you think Thailand and Burma and Sri Lanka are going to join together all because they're Buddhist majority countries? So the question is that what is it that is common to all nations? And you know, the only thing that is common to them is that at some particular point, these people, for varying combinations of reasons, going to do with their history and the context, decide that they are united and they want to be part of one nation. That's it. When you talk about the strands, so this is the only thing that's common. I've written my book. Above all, the nation is a cultural entity, not fixed on some fixed characteristic. A cultural entity lodged above all in consciousness, striving to become a political fact. Now, you've had certain nations that emerged early, like France and the United States. But you have a whole host of countries, including India, which emerged really in the 20th century, and they emerged from the anti-colonial struggle. Any number of African countries became here. Race was not the main characteristic. They're all Africans in some way, etc. But that doesn't mean that they don't fight with each other. They don't have their different nations. It's not religion. It's not language. What made them into separate was the struggle against colonial rule. And the same thing applies to India. The India that is formed is really today the form along the administrative boundaries of what the British left. In fact, most of the African nation states are the boundaries, the territorial boundaries are those that were left by British administration for the convenience of British administration. So Britain brought in Nagaland and elsewhere. Nagaland is never Hindu. It has much more connection among this thing here. Do you think Hindutva will say, oh, let Nagaland go free? No, this is also part of India. This is it. Hindu essence of India and all the rest of the stuff over here. So the point here is that you have substantial. In the case of Latin America, what was the common strand of nationalism we're talking about? They were what are called settler nationalisms. European settlers went there. They devastated the domestic population and indigenous population in varying degrees. They had the African slave trade in different countries of Latin America. There was much greater intermarriage and mixing, much less in the United States. And then you had different categories of settlers. And it was the settlers who settled there, who came from Europe, who then fought against the mother country of Spain and Portugal to become independent. The same thing with the Dutch and the British and the Dutch, for example, and British were the settlers in South Africa, and so on. So that's one strand, ascetic. Then you have your other ones, this thing. Then you have some linguistic. Then you have your anti-national movement. And some countries' strand is they came up after the breakup of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. It was not written in the books that this is going to happen. It happened. And then you have new countries emerging. So different ways. And don't be surprised if there are other countries that are going to emerge. I gave you some examples of already what's been happening. Czechoslovakia breaks up. South Sudan is created. Scotland may go independent. This may happen. Donbass and have been taken over in Ukraine and all that. In other words, the nation is a state of mind, which is why it can be born and it can die out. So you had East Germany, everybody thought East Germany would be separate, but then they came together. So you have all this that's taken place. So that's my response to this question of strands of common against nation states.
Yes, I'd further like to know from you, what do you think is the way forward? Do you think the secular left can unite everybody and fight against far-right nationalist politics? Or what do you make sense of the future?
Future is grim. Let's understand how, and I gave you the example. Let's understand the rise of Hindutva in India and always have an internationalist perspective. Even in the part of the world which is majority Muslim, the Middle East, West Asia, North Africa, after the Second World War, when they fought and got independence, many of these countries became independent before and after India did, for example, the dominant currents there were not Islamic currents. They were nationalist currents, which were secular. Communists, Baathists, Nasserists. It's only after the systematic defeat of these that you begin to have Islamic currents of Islamic nationalism coming up over here. If you look at all the world between 1945, end of the Second World War, and up to the late 70s, early 80s. This was a period in which in the advanced countries, you had what was called the golden years, greater prosperity for all, welfare state in the advanced West and so on. And in the third world countries or in the countries that were developing, had become no longer colonized, an independent country, there was a promise of development. We will develop here. What happens by the late 70s? You have, in fact, it is only from the late 70s that you have the rise. And there was also called, socialism is the way forward, this, that, and forward. You have the rise after the late 70s or 80s of what's called the politics of cultural exclusivism, which took 4 forms and took place everywhere. What were these 4 forms? Race, ethnicity, religion, the nation, irredentism, and either separately or in combination. And it takes place everywhere. So from the early 80s onwards. It's taking place everywhere. You know that the far-right authoritarian populism, not only in India, it's in other countries. Am I right? Over the same period? In which case, if it's happening everywhere, then there has to be, first of all, a principle of explanation that is also global, or not just fixed to India. So what is that transnational explanatory factor that helps to explain why you have the rise of the politics of cultural exclusivism everywhere? What do you think it is? Any idea? But it's fairly obvious. And that is that from the late 70s, early, you have the rise of a particular form of neoliberal capitalist globalization, which creates dramatic inequalities of income, wealth, and therefore of power, which degrades democracies, and which leads to a situation in which you have people not having a decent life anywhere, everywhere, ordinary people, not because there's not enough to produce, because even if there is overproduction, they don't have the capacity to actually sort out their even material well-being and so on. You have privatization, which means public welfare systems have declined, healthcare systems declined, even where they were strong, whether it was Sweden or whether it was Europe. And of course, the country that was the wealthiest of all never even had a decent welfare system, healthcare system compared to Western Europe, where it's decreasing. So you have problems of economic development. You have ideological disarray. You have, of course, I've given you the politics of cultural exclusivity everywhere, on all three countries. In the so-called Second World War, irredentist nationalism, Soviet Union, Yugoslavia breakup. In the case of the advanced so-called first world country, anti-immigrant and racist xenophobia, right? And everywhere, the rise of revanchist forms of religious extremism. Oh, but the Semitic religions are bad. But the Indian religions are so good. Hinduism is so calm. Buddhism, how many number of actors in Hollywood want to become Buddhists because they are? And what do you have among Buddhism? You have Buddhist revanchism, ugly Buddhist-based revanchism and nationalism, which is anti-democratic in Burma, which is anti-democratic in Sri Lanka, which is anti-democratic in Thailand, all Buddhist countries. You have Christian evangelism. You have attempt to make Khalistan, but that's subdued. And of course, you have Islamic extremism. You have Hindu extremism. So everywhere you have this. And the last point, what does globalization do? What globalization does also, and this is something that's very important, is that globalization also means that most people, ordinary people's understanding of the forces that shape them, they're no longer able to comprehend because there are such an array of forces that shape their lives. In other words, what's sometimes called the time-space coordinates of a lived existence is no longer capable of even helping a person to understand the much larger array of forces that operate in a global time-space coordinates. Once upon a time, the Muluk was Amara region in Ratnagiri. You could understand what's happened there. Like in old times, he's ruling us this. Now, so many things are interconnected. You can't. What happens? There is tremendous psychic dislocation. There's huge. So what do you do then? You try to cling on to identities that you think are stable, which are given to you by birth. My religion, my race, my ethnicity, my language. And that gives you some kind of anchor in trying to cope, in trying to understand. This is the prism in which I must see things and all. Which of course is ridiculous. How do you fight it? At various levels. You can't separate the question. In many ways, in fact, fighting for secularity, okay, fine. You fight critical of religion and all, but be very careful how you handle religion. And let's understand what secularism is about. Secularism is not anti-religion. It's about the terms of coexistence between the secular and the religious. And the terms of coexistence between the secular and religious is one in which religion must play a much less important part than it did in the past. Because you now have a much more complex society with multiple forms of authority. And what living in a modern life means that you have this identity at this particular time and place, and then you have to shift your identity here to understand it. So sometimes when you want to go to the Gurdwara or church or temple, you're a Hindu. Sometimes you're a teacher in a school, your identity is a teacher. Sometimes it's your class. Sometimes it's your caste. Sometimes it's your nation. Sometimes it's your humanness. You don't have to be a black person to be horrified by racism against black people. You can be a man and have the identity of man, but you can be horrified about the oppression of women. And you can be a woman and you can be horrified about the oppression of transgender and so on. So we also have it, and we can be very angry. And we can say, our government is doing disgusting things by supporting Israel. And you had white people in the United States of America, not just black people, who said the United States alignment with apartheid South Africa is disgusting, and we are against our government. So you have these capacities which reflect. are different. But it's much more comfortable for various reasons to shift into one here and then just use that as the main prism for being. And this is, of course, cultivated. What Hindu nationalism, Buddhist revanchism, a certain French, not religious, but Frenchness against anti-immigrants, wants to make a particular kind of identity, the way in which you must perceive the world around you, and focus on that. And we have to fight at all levels. We have to fight for greater democracy. We have to fight for much greater welfareism, much greater education, and so on. If you have a whole community of people, regardless of their religious affiliation, who are doctors and teachers, who meet each other, work with each other, who have better improvements in their lives and so on, that will take care a great deal from even overcoming these aspects. And yes, there are irrational aspects of religion, which you do have to fight, but it's not easy, but it's important. That's why, of course, Hindutva, which understands this thing here, was very much against Davolkar, Kalburgi, and Pansara, to the point that they were killed. And these were not just people who talked about rationality in terms of what's, don't think that this is going to help you. They also provided alternatives material. So Davolkar was also a doctor, and he was also guiding people to go to doctors and all to also be able to improve their conditions. The same thing with the rational movement in Kerala, which took place earlier and so on. So you have to fight. Don't think in terms of eliminating, and you're not anti-religious. Why do I say that? Forget your religious intellectuals and forget your Hindu nationalist essence and nonsense, all that. But why do most ordinary people believe in religion? 7 reasons. One, health. Please give me health so my bachas okay. Wealth. Lakshmi, please give me money. Puja, my business successful. Wealth. Power. Puja and Prerna are teachers and they are giving me bad marks. Please, God, fix them. Or my neighbor is bad, or give me power. Right? Fourth, solace. How do you cope with the death of a loved one, of a child, of a brother, a sister, a parent? Solace. A sense of community. Some kind of moral guide. Oh, this is the way we should be. What's good and bad. Lastly, immortality. Even though I die, my soul lives on. And this thing, you feel the same thing when you talk about, I don't want an adopted child. I want my own child with my own blood. Because after I die, something will be there. Of course, these are reasons people believe. There are many irrational aspects to it. There are reasons we have to also fight against, for example, which means that religions can change and must change. Why do all the religious geniuses, whether it's Shankaracharya, or whether it's whoever you want to hear, or Buddha, or this thing, why are they all men? Jesus. Well, God doesn't even play dice. What about, why are they all better off? Not a single one of them was a slave or a helot. Jesus was the son of a carpenter, artisan. Why? Apparently, God doesn't play dice when he chooses his religious personnel. They are part of the existing reality and context. Religion change. Why don't we have women granthees? Why shouldn't there be? And some religions are changing to a greater extent here. But others than that, the RSS Sangh Parivar is going to fight against Mangal Sutra. Is it going to talk about complete flexibility of women here? Or do they go on and on about the family and the importance of the woman's role in the family to present it and all the rest? And so, of course, change. And you can even have a change in terms of saying that the most important thing is not so much trying to have heaven on earth or whatever, but let's try to make a heaven here. And you do have some currents, especially in Christianity, what we call liberation theology, that was saying that the most important divide is not between believers and non-believers. It's between the oppressors and the oppressed. And therefore, you even had religious groups and currents which said that it's the people who are rich and powerful that are enemies, and we should work with others to move that. So you have to fight for that. But of course, what's happening is the change is going in many ways in the opposite direction. So you have to fight it at all this. And the most important fight, in my view, and I should maybe, I'm talking again too long, is that the greatest reason for the success of the Sangh Parivar is the fact that they have people implanted in civil society, which has been now reinforced by the state. So you have lots of people who have just joined the Sangh Parivar and all for the sake of material benefits and all that. But you also have people who really buy into their ideology. And you have long-standing people who have worked at a long time over here. What we need are people who are going to work on the ground. And that for that means activism. And it means a certain ideological commitment and discipline. And that ideology has to be a humane one. But you convince people also by what is done on the ground, in fact. So insofar as the farmers' struggle was able to bring people together, regardless of it had some effect. Not enough, as the elections show, but some effect, definitely. Insofar as you have women coming out. And interestingly enough, something also very interesting happened in the CAA discussion. In many of the urban areas, metropolises, you had young people of different religious faiths joining in with the CAA in the name of the Constitution. Before this, you find, in fact, that young people who have become voters for the first time, if you like, voted for Modi's party. They don't have any recollection of the national movement, national liberation, all that, etc. My parents were not leftists, but they were very much secular and Nehru and all that. But interestingly, many of these young people actually rallied. Not everyone, but there was that. And they also did. So you have that. But and you have to fight because our institutions are being taken over. In the legal profession, you have the Supreme Court being suborned in so many ways. So as lawyers, you'll have to choose sides, you'll have to fight. And there are lawyers who are fighting against it, and there are also lawyers who are going against it. So in every branch, there is the possibility and the necessity of fighting against the forces which are going in everywhere, among lawyers, among educationists, among doctors. Ayurveda and all should be free to do surgery if you just had Ayurveda or greater, everything. So it's a fight at all levels.
Seems like a good place to end this hopeful chat. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was an incredible talk, and it's always a pleasure to learn from you and talk with you about religion and nationalism. Thank you so much for taking time out and being with us.